It was barely 7:30 a.m. when the pounding on my gate rattled me out of my coffee. The sun had just cleared the ridge, spilling gold across the pasture where my two Mars Juniper and Star were quietly grazing. I stepped onto the porch, coffee still steaming in my hand, and there she was, HOA Karen, dressed like she was heading into battle, complete with oversized sunglasses, an HOA polo shirt 3 sizes too tight, and that signature stance, feet planted, hips forward, chin lifted like she'd already won. She didn't say good morning. She pointed straight at my horses as if she'd just discovered contraband in plain sight. "Those animals are a violation of HOA regulations," she announced, her voice carrying that syrupy condescension that's somehow sharper than yelling. "You have 72 hours to remove them from the property, or you'll face daily fines until they're gone." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the absurdity. This land had been a working ranch since the early 1900s. My great-grandparents raised cattle here, my father broke wild Mustangs here, and I'd been riding since before I could read. Juniper and Star weren't just pets. They were family, therapy, and a living link to generations past. And more importantly, I had a court order issued just last year that guaranteed my right to keep them here despite the HOA's attempts to impose blanket bans on livestock. But Karen wasn't interested in history or legality. She flipped through the pages on her clipboard, pretending to find the exact clause that condemned my horses. "It's right here," she said, tapping the paper. "Section 14B. No hoofed animals within the HOA perimeter." She actually smiled, as if reciting scripture. I set my coffee down, leaned on the porch railing, and asked her if she'd like to see something interesting. Her smile faltered just a little, but she still nodded. I went inside, opened my desk drawer, and pulled out a folder thicker than her rulebook. On top was the court order, embossed with the county seal, signed by a judge whose patience with HOA overreach was well known. The order stated plainly that my property, being pre-existing agricultural land before the HOA's incorporation, was exempt from livestock restrictions. And for extra measure, I had a notarized affidavit from the county zoning office confirming the same. When I stepped back out and held the document toward her, she didn't take it. She just squinted, as if sheer refusal to read it might make it disappear. "That's not binding on the HOA," she stammered. But there was no conviction in her voice. That's when I dropped the real twist. Not only was it binding, but any attempt to fine me or forcibly remove my horses would be in direct violation of a standing court order and action that could result in legal penalties against her personally. Her cheeks flushed crimson, but before she could launch into another tirade, a voice called out from behind her. "Morning, Karen." It was Deputy Ramirez, pulling up in his cruiser. He'd been my friend since high school, and he happened to be the same deputy who served her the court papers last year during the original livestock dispute. When he saw her standing there, pointing at my pasture again, he shook his head slowly. "We've already been over this. You try to enforce that rule here, you're in contempt. And I don't think you want to go down that road." Karen tried to pivot, accusing me of running a commercial stable without a permit. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "2 horses? That's your evidence." The smirk in his voice was enough to make her lips purse so tightly they nearly disappeared. At that point, I decided to turn the knife just a bit. I pulled out my phone and began recording, calmly explaining for the camera that my horses were legal, protected by court order, and that any further harassment from the HOA would be documented for my attorney. I caught every flicker of panic in her eyes as she realized the narrative was slipping out of her control. She muttered something about bringing this up at the board meeting and stormed off, her sneakers crunching on the gravel. Ramirez watched her go, then turned to me with a grin. "Bet she won't mention this meeting to anyone." Oh, how wrong he was, because by that afternoon, my video had already hit the neighborhood forum, and the comments section was a wildfire of people telling their own HOA horror stories. And buried in those comments was a bombshell from another neighbor, one that would unravel the last scraps of Karen's authority and expose a much darker motive behind her crusade to remove my horses. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening, and word had already spread that something big was going down. I arrived early, not because I wanted a front row seat, but because I knew Karen would try to manipulate the agenda before the crowd arrived. Sure enough, when I walked in, she was huddled with 2 board members, whispering furiously, the clipboard back in her grip like a shield. She spotted me, stiffened, and muttered something under her breath that I didn't catch, but judging by the sideways glance from one of the other board members, I didn't need to. As the meeting kicked off, she launched into a spiel about protecting property values and preserving the character of the neighborhood. But her voice had that brittle edge too high, too fast, as if she was trying to talk past the weight of what had already happened. Then she got to the part about livestock violations, clearly gearing up to make me the villain of the evening. That's when I stood up, court order in hand. Before you go any further, you should know this document makes everything you just said irrelevant. And it's already been enforced by the county court. I walked to the front, placed the order on the table, and stepped back. The board members leaned in, reading the judge's seal, the signatures. A few exchanged looks that weren't subtle. Karen tried to speak over the murmurs, but her voice faltered as another hand went up in the crowd. It was Ms. Lang from 3 streets over. Karen, didn't you tell me last month that the HOA was planning to redevelop the green lots for a new park? Karen blinked, then nodded slowly. And didn't you also say we'd need to remove all non-conforming structures and animals for that plan to work? Another nod. Now Ms. Lang's eyes narrowed. Funny thing, I found a real estate prospectus last week from a development company, one that's been sniffing around this area. They're offering big payouts for land that can be cleared for luxury condos. And in their preliminary sketches, guess what's missing? Every single property that still has open acreage, including yours, mine, and his. She gestured to me. The room went dead silent. Karen opened her mouth, but before she could spit out a denial, Mr. Collins, one of the quieter board members, cleared his throat. I've seen those sketches too, and I've seen the emails Karen sent to that company. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I didn't have to say a word. The neighbors were connecting the dots. Her push to remove my horses wasn't about rules, or aesthetics, or even property values. It was about making my land easier to sell to a developer who wanted it cleared. The court order protecting my horses was also protecting my land from exactly that kind of hostile takeover. The meeting descended into a storm of voices, neighbors demanding answers, others calling for her resignation on the spot. Karen's face went through a dozen shades, from crimson rage to ghostly pale. She tried to shout above the noise, claiming the emails were taken out of context, and that she was only exploring options for the community's benefit. But the more she spoke, the louder the outrage grew. Finally, Mr. Collins raised his voice over the chaos. I motioned to remove Karen from her position as HOA president effective immediately, pending investigation into misconduct. The motion was seconded before Karen could even sit down, and when the vote came, the result was overwhelming. She was out. But that wasn't the end. 2 weeks later, the county attorney's office sent me a letter thanking me for providing documentation of Karen's repeated attempts to circumvent the court order. Apparently, the emails and prospectus Ms. Lang found had been handed over, and the investigation into fraudulent use of HOA funds was underway. Not long after, I saw Karen's car parked outside the county courthouse, not in her usual power-walking stride, but slouched low behind the wheel, like someone hoping not to be noticed. In the meantime, life at my ranch returned to normal. Juniper and Star grazed in peace, and I even started giving riding lessons to neighborhood kids whose parents wanted them to learn something other than how to tap on a screen. The new HOA board, now led by Mr. Collins, passed a resolution reaffirming the rights of pre-existing properties to keep livestock. Eddie, my friend the surveyor, printed out large laminated boundary maps and posted them in the community center with a big sign. These are the only maps that matter. Karen, she didn't last much longer in the neighborhood. Rumor had it that her developer friends had cut her loose the second she became a liability. When her house went up for sale, the listing sat for months. Word travels fast, and nobody wanted to buy a home with that kind of baggage attached to it. She eventually moved out under the cover of night. No farewell parties, no friends waving from the driveway, just the faint screech of U-Haul brakes and the dull thump of her reputation hitting rock bottom. The irony? The developer project she'd been pushing for collapsed anyway when the county rejected the rezoning application. Every plot she'd been trying to clear stayed right where it was, mine included. One afternoon, as I watched Juniper lazily swish her tail in the sun, I thought about how close Karen had come to getting what she wanted. If I hadn't kept that court order close, if Ms. Lang hadn't found that prospectus, if Ramirez hadn't been there to back me up, it could have been a very different ending. Instead, the community came out stronger, wiser, and far less willing to let one arrogant person hold the reins. My pasture is still here, my horses are still here, and now so is a little sign I hung on the barn door that says, "Not for sale at any price." Because some things aren't just about property or rules. They're about history, principle, and standing your ground when someone tries to trample both. So now I'll ask you, if someone tried to erase a piece of your life's history with nothing but a clipboard and a smirk, would you fight them to the last fence post like I did, or let them take it without a fight?